Hey, Dr. Scott Bolland here, and welcome to Leading in 10, the live stream designed to help you amplify your effectiveness in leading yourself and others in only 10 minutes. Now, we've all had those moments when a comment in a meeting, feedback from a colleague, or even just the tone somebody uses suddenly triggers a strong emotional response. In that moment, as our brain flips its lid, our ability to think clearly, collaborate, and show up as our best selves goes right out the window. Today, I'm joined by mindset coach Fiona Walsh to unpack the science behind these reactions and, more importantly, practical techniques you can use to lessen their hold on you. Thanks for joining us, Fiona. How's it going?
Good, thanks, Scott. It's great to be here today.
So we're talking about triggers. What is your definition, or what do you view as being an emotional trigger?
So a trigger is an external event, like somebody's words that they've said, the tone they're using. It might be a situation you find yourself in, or even an environment that sparks a strong emotional reaction inside your body. And some people might call it getting my buttons pushed, or I got activated, or I got really pissed off and frustrated. There's a whole range of emotions that will come up when you're triggered, but it's a real flooding of emotion inside your body.
And just hearing you say that, it kind of feels like it's in some sense an inappropriate response, or a over-the-top response to something that other people might not be as triggered by, if you know what I mean. It's kind of an internal response based on previous experience, previous trauma. I don't know, where do these triggers come from?
So you would know Dan Siegel's work, and he talks about how when you start with your brain all together, but when you get triggered, what happens with your brain is you flip your lid. So the rational part of your brain separates from the emotional part of your brain, and when your rational part of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, goes offline, you respond in an automatic, reactive way, which quite often is like, "Oh my goodness, who was that person? That wasn't me. I was not showing up as my best self." And you're responding from an emotional state. Now, this emotional state can usually be tied back to a past experience in your life, either as a child or a teenager, where you had an overwhelming emotional experience, and it's stuck in your subconscious mind. And that is actually what's being triggered in real time. It's just that your body and your nervous system doesn't differentiate between today and this meeting room, or what happened to you perhaps when you were 6 or 7 and something happened to you at home or in the schoolyard.
So in terms of what you've described is really the amygdala hijack, in the sense that this is an evolutionary process that was really beneficial in our evolutionary history. So you're facing a tiger. What happens is generally the sensory information goes to the thalamus, which is the relay center of the brain, and it goes both to the prefrontal cortex, which is that thinking part, the reasoning part, and also the amygdala, which is sort of emotional processing. And generally, if it's a happy state, the prefrontal cortex, as you said, is online, and you can think through beyond the current situation. So your mind can be elsewhere. You can be, thinking creatively. You can be reflecting on previous experience, that sort of stuff. But again, evolutionary speaking, that's not a great situation if you're getting attacked by a tiger. So in that sense, there's a trigger in saying this is the amygdala recognizes that as a threat, and it's saying this is not the time for thinking creatively, to being outside of yourself. This is the time for actually being in the current situation, to either fight, flight, or flee, really. So it's kind of those three options. So again, it's that evolutionary process, which was actually really beneficial, of saying when you're under threat, this is what the brain should be doing. You should be actually fixated on the task, solving it, running away, or fighting. And as you said, there's that physiological response as well. You get the increased heart rate, the blood gets redirected to the muscles to run away from the situation. So evolutionarily speaking, that made a lot of sense. But in the workplace, having that response of, okay, my thinking becomes fast and reactive, and you're a threat to me. I need to deal with that.
and as you said, you're likely to respond in a way that you haven't thought it through.
One of the things that's really interesting as well is like you mentioned 3 responses, but there's also a 4th response, which is I'd love to just talk to, because it's a really important one. It's one that people may not be aware of, but it's very common in the workplace. So the first, your nervous system usually has a primary response, 1 or 2. So what you might see, fight in modern day terms. So in the old world, that was fighting back to the tiger, because your life was at stake. Our brains and bodies don't know whether or not it's a tiger, or your boss just saying, Scott, didn't like the way you showed up in that presentation yesterday. And you're like, oh, wow, here comes some constructive feedback. So fight can be when someone is triggered and they start to get a bit, like, I would say they can be confrontational, they can be defensive, they try and take control of the conversation or the situation. In flight, I've been in a meeting where someone literally picked up their laptop and ran out of the meeting room. So that was, I'm like, get me out of the... So again, freeze is if someone's sitting there and they're just like, and you're like, what's going on? Why is Betty like frozen on the spot? And you can literally tell their brain has stopped working. But the latest one, which I love, is fawn.
It's fawn.
Which is for people pleasers. And so, and I was, until I learned about this was my one. And you become very agreeable, and you're prioritizing other people's needs above your own, and so you don't fight back. You can become this very adaptable person who makes it very easy to have on the team, but in that moment you might self-abandon from what your real position is, say in a conversation, to try and keep the peace with the people around you. And surprisingly in men and women. Because I think people-pleasing has been traditionally, people thought, oh, that's what women do.
Yeah, right.
But I'm seeing it more in men as well.
Okay, so when you're sort of saying that it comes from childhood and experiences...
Well, even the example I gave before about someone saying to you, Scott, I'd like to give you some feedback on how you showed up in that presentation. That can usually be traced back to a past experience where a parent, a teacher, a sports coach told you off for making a mistake as a child. And that was for you in that moment, an overwhelming emotional experience that then becomes part of your programming. And that is the 7-year-old playing out for you in your adult self, when you have this emotional response. As I said, your nervous system and your body doesn't know whether or not it's happening in today's real time or if it's in the past. So it's sort of timelines collapse. And so it's your 7-year-old that's actually responding a lot of the time in those situations, and not your true, authentic, adult self.
And I think so there's that sort of historical context of this is, what has happened to me in the past. I think the other thing that people talk about is the current context. So have I learnt in my current workplace that this is a safe response or safe behavior or not? And that can be triggering. So if I know, somebody's criticizing me, and in the past that meant really bad ramifications for the workplace, that's a lot more triggering than the same comment, but I know what happens next from that comment. So there's sort of situational factors that can amplify that response, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think also one thing for people to be aware of, if you're overly stressed and actually operating in survival mode, your threshold to reach trigger is way smaller than if you're grounded, calm, you've been for your run in the morning, you did your meditation, you're coming in, you know what I mean? So there's lots of factors that can play into how quickly you get triggered and how big your trigger response is as well.
So given that it's this long-term strategy that's been with you for a very long time, how can people manage or I guess change that behaviour?
Yeah, so I would say in the real time, I would talk to people mostly about regulating in the moment so that they can get their nervous system to calm, because when you're in that response, as you've said before, you're unable to communicate clearly you can't collaborate, you can't be creative, like you're not helpful. So calming your body down is the first thing to do once you realize that you have been triggered, and the actual self-awareness of realizing you're triggered can take work as well. So a lot of people will be like, might have the response, but a lot of people are aware of how it actually feels in their body. So they may not be labeling the emotion, but the sensations in their bodies, like, oh, I've got, my heart is racing, I've got tension, I'm like clenching my hands, I feel heat in my body. You know what I mean? So I might be even speaking faster or using my hands more. Like, just becoming aware of like how your body and sensations is responding is really important. And then using breath work is like taking really deep belly breaths in, where you elongate your exhale in a meeting, can be a really good way to try and calm and activate your parasympathetic nervous system. To help you get back into control of what's going on, because you're on autopilot, you're on an emotional autopilot effectively, so you're not necessarily in control of your words or how you're showing up. One of the other fun ones that I always say to people is having if you've got a stress ball or something like this on your desk, you can throw it from side to side, and what you're doing while you're breathing, while you're doing it, you can do this while you're on a call. So bilateral stimulation also helps your two brain hemispheres start talking to each other again and closing, you know, I talked about flipping the lid, closing it back together so that your your rational brain comes back online, because that's really what you're trying to do in the short term. And if you also are aware that you have triggers and you're working on it, people around you know that you get triggered. Like, don't be under any illusions about that. So saying, I'm working on these responses, I'm going to need to take a break, I'm feeling really activated right now, having that language in your team can be really helpful. In COVID, when I was working a lot on teams, as we all were, one team I worked with, if someone was triggered, a picture of Elmo would pop up in the GIFs part of thing, and we knew that Elmo was a cue that person was triggered. Another group used a ladder, because, you know, like the ladder of inference is your ladder is how far up your trigger state. If I saw a silly picture of someone climbing ladder and falling off, I'd be like, oh, that person's triggered. Okay, cool. So we had symbols in our workplace as well to be able to communicate where you're at emotionally, because quite often you might not be able to see or know where somebody's at.
So I just want to say a couple of things. So in terms of what you're saying, there's a saying I like, which is strike while the iron is cool, never hot. Right? So it's the idea that, you know, the best state to be in is this calm response, and what you need to do is don't strike while the iron is hot. How do you resolve that issue? One is that self-awareness of, I'm getting hot, what can I do about it? It is taking a break, it is breathing, it is calming, but that takes self-awareness of noticing that you're going hot, and that's a skill in itself.
One of the other things that's really useful around once you've been triggered is to really take some time to, after the fact, to be really curious and compassionate to yourself around what actually was going on. So don't brush it under the table, and that's just me, and sometimes I lose my cool, I'm that person. Don't be that leader. There's some really critical things you can do afterwards yourself. You know, if you have a coach or a therapist, always take your triggers to them, because that's their wheelhouse. But like, if you are a journaler or someone who reflects afterwards, you want to think through, like, what was happening, what feelings or emotions came up for me, what was the sensations in my body, how did I react, what was my behavior, and then these ones are interesting. What did this trigger remind me of? And see if you can unravel back perhaps to like a pattern at your previous workplace where people raised their voices, and you know that's triggering for you, or something that happened in your childhood. And then, what story am I telling myself about this situation? So what's my inner narrative? What's my assumptions that I'm making? And then what meaning am I attaching to this? And that's starting to unpack down to meaning making, sense making, and then root cause assumptions that you hold about the world, and, you know.
So
there's a whole range of strategies. So what you were sort of talking is the cognitive reappraisal of what's the story I'm telling myself. Is that accurate? Is it not? How can I challenge that? So that's sort of an internal thing. I can deal with the physiology of what's happening to reduce it. There's other things that we haven't mentioned that I want to quickly flag on, and this comes from Gottman's work as well. So what I found about Gottman is he's saying don't be too worried about the amygdala hijack. And this is kind of interesting. What he's saying is that most really amazing relationships, people still fight and lose their shit. It actually is what happens afterwards that's really important. You know, what happens between the arguments that's really important. So, you know, making that positive emotional investment afterwards of how do you unpack what went on and apologize or whatever. But also, is there gratitude? Is there all these positive things happening between those, you know, those hijacked moments is far more predictive of a good relationship than losing your shit occasionally, if you know what I mean. So the idea is it's an and, right? What can you do? What can you do to, you know, reduce the likelihood it's going to happen? But it's not about reducing it to 0%, because what he's saying is you need superhuman emotional intelligence to do that. There are other things you can do, you know, in terms of it's an and situation.
And I was going to say, like, I love to say the triggers are our teachers, and they're our real life moments of opportunities for growth. And so we'll have them throughout our whole life. No one is going to be perfect, and so even if you've done all the coaching and all the therapy and all the things, everyone gets triggered. It's part of being human. It's part of what makes life fun. But, you know, it's, as you said, it's then, being curious and compassionate with yourself that, like, oh, yeah, this happens, right? And then what was going on? What can I learn about myself from this? Because there's some really juicy data in here for me to tackle. And then, you know, how can I hopefully respond in a different way next time?
And speaking of that, another thing that Gottman said is it's actually the first 3 minutes of a conversation that determine its outcome. So if you walk into, you know, this is the whole, you know, strike while the iron is cool, not hot. If you walk into a difficult conversation heated and, you know, aggressive, it's not going to go well with you. So just be aware of how you actually enter the conversation in the first place with a calm mind, and that's more predictive of how things are going to go. So it's like, is this really the right time to be, you know, mentioning this to my partner or colleague, you know, or should I calm down first and approach it in a calm manner, if you know what I mean? So how you enter these conversations is really important as well.
I always say to people, think about the before, the during, and then the after. And the before is you're going into a performance review conversation. You have a history of getting triggered when people tell you stuff that you didn't like to hear about yourself. So what can you do to prepare yourself for what's coming? And then in the moment, use your tools like your breathing and your ball and stuff like that. And then afterwards, do the work to figure out, how did I show up? What pattern? What story? How did I feel? And start to unpack it. And it's a real cycle of, you know, that you keep looping through.
So we've talked about a lot of things today. If we could summarize this conversation, what do you think the take-home message is for leaders and managers and business owners?
The take-home message would be, as triggers are our teachers, and they are just giving us these beautiful data points to understand ourselves better, to get curious and compassionate with what's going on in our inner world, maybe why we're sensitive to certain people or environments, and also a deeper opportunity to explore things that might have happened in our past that we don't realize are playing out and interfering with our ability to show up as our best and authentic selves every single day at work and at home and in life.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's been a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Thanks so much. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe at succeedingscientifically.com. Cheers.